So if you're watching this video and asking yourself, Carson, it was the start today of Big 12 Media Days. Why are you not talking about Big 12 Media Days and the way West Virginia plays a part of it? Well, it's because Neil Brown doesn't talk yet, people. We've heard from other teams and around the conference and the conference commissioner, Brett Yormark. So I'll have a lot more to say about Big 12 Media Days and especially about West Virginia getting a look into the preseason depth chart. Finally, we have something tangible produced from the football program that we can take a look at and remark on after all that I've talked about over the last 6 months since the 2023 season ended. We can talk about so much more as it pertains to Big 12 Media Days, but I want to take a pause and say that if you were caught up in between a lot of other things going on in the world more important than West Virginia football over the last week or so, with it being the July 4th holiday, and happy belated July 4th to everybody out there. If you were in between many hot dogs and hamburgers, or out at a lake or beach, or doing something somewhere across God's green earth, you may have missed it. Is that it's not necessarily a red flag, but it is. We need to take a pause for caution on West Virginia losing momentum in its fall 2025 high school recruiting class. For all of the talk that you've probably seen across social media, even by some media outlets here over the course of the last 6 weeks, there has been a lot of good, and I'm going to touch on that. But there has also been just recently some bad that we need to pump the brakes on how much excitement there is about this recruiting class, because it's a lot of the same, and the same isn't necessarily so great for West Virginia as it might not really representative of their national top 25 ranking as of right now. So let me back up and kind of give you a breakdown now that I'm 2 minutes in here to talk about this. So really it kind of all started, I talked about this about 6 weeks ago, is that West Virginia was going to get into its home stretch during the months of June, during the weekends in June, all the way up through about July 4th. The last real recruiting weekend was the last weekend there in June, but with official visits and camps that they kind of use alongside official visit weekends and so on and so forth for both rising seniors and rising juniors. And for the most part, for the seniors, they're closing the deal. If these student athletes hadn't already visited as juniors or sophomores, if they had, they're closing the deal, or this is the hope of they've been talking for a long time, getting alongside other players on their respective sides of the ball, quarterbacks with receivers, defensive backs with linebackers, so on and so forth. And a lot of progress was made, starting it off with that first weekend. I think I made a video right around that time that West Virginia got a commitment from its highest offensive ranked player in DeAndre Desanor, running back from Delray Beach, Florida, 4-star running back. Then there were definitely some wins. There was getting a flip from a wide receiver, Tariq Mallory, really kicking it off right behind Desanor, flipping from a Wake Forest to West Virginia. It was like, okay, they really mean business. Then getting a Ramondo Johnson, defensive end, great size, speed, combination, high-end 3-star linebacker, probably be an outside linebacker. Then getting a defensive back from Richmond, Virginia, to pick the Mountaineers over the Turkeys down there in Blacksburg. I mean, Frank Beamer must be beside himself. The best cornerback in the state of Virginia picking West Virginia over Virginia Tech. Wow. Won some battles for two defensive backs, Sirius Stinyard and Sammy Etienne, both from the state of Florida, over Kansas State, and then pulling in Amir Leonard Jean Charles, a 4-star defensive tackle, 6'4", 300 from Tennessee. And then falling back off after from Neil Brown's hometown, Danville, Kentucky, Montaven Quisenberry, picking the Mountaineers over Kentucky. A wide receiver, I mean, you watch his highlights, and I always am very hesitant ever to call any sort of combo player in the skill positions, wide receiver, running back, a Tavon Austin-like player, but you watch his highlights, and a lot of things really excite me about this player. So, a lot of momentum. But then it seemed like just about 2.5 weeks ago, some, sprung a leak or something in the hull, lost the training wheels on the bike, when defensive tackle, offensive lineman, combo player playing two ways, another 4-star, Nick Moore, about 6'2", 290 pounds, fringe 4-star, 3-star player, depending upon wherever outlets that you look, decides he was about to commit midweek, and everyone, across the Twitterverse was saying it was West Virginia, and then right about an hour before his commitment, he pauses on his commitment, before he was supposed to take an official visit to Tennessee. People thought after that, not necessarily decommitment, but holding off on the announcement, he was signed, sealed to Tennessee, and what do you know, he commits about a week after he takes that visit. So that was the first, note of, crap, you win some, you lose some. If it's just one, there's still a lot of players that West Virginia could have a chance on. Then the huge news breaks right before July 4th that week, in that class of 2026, the highest graded quarterback that West Virginia has signed, like 4-star, since Will Grier, even higher than Nico Marchiol was rated a few years ago in his class. Brody McWhorter, quarterback, commits over some huge competition in the South, namely Auburn, who really, really wanted him. And he has a cousin who's a 4-star offensive lineman who was previously committed to Arkansas, now is decommitted. You hope and pray that he's going to follow alongside his cousin in Morgantown, but still a long time away from that. Still, we're 2 years away from those two guys even being in Morgantown for their first freshman fall camp. Sorry, I wanted to make this video yesterday even because it seemed more timely around Big 12 Media Days, but I'm just on like the back nine of a summer cold, unfortunately. So if I take a moment to cough or something, I apologize. But, moving on. So right at that same time when the McWhorter commitment was coming out and the internet was afray, the defensive lineman that West Virginia had highest on its recruiting board, Wilnerson Telemake, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, chooses Wisconsin over West Virginia when it was highly regarded that he was going to be picking West Virginia. Had been previously up to Morgantown before, and he picks Wisconsin over West Virginia. So your top defensive recruit prospect doesn't pick you. Now, a 4-star other, defensive back, Carson Lawrence, who's already previously committed, now is still committed to Vanderbilt, but via taking an official visit to West Virginia, and I think he went to another place afterwards, expecting a flip out of him. No sign of him as of yet. And then it's been a series over this course of the last week and a half. Cam Strong picking West Virginia, or picking NC State over West Virginia. A 4-star linebacker, Grant Bierman, picking out for Purdue over West Virginia after apparently having an incredible weekend, eye-opening weekend for his visit. I mean, the article was really raving about him that I read by Keenan Cummings from Rivals on this. Dwayne Galloway, a guy who I think I talked about and a couple of weeks ago, West Virginia was pursuing, fringe 4 to 5-star cornerback from Columbus, Ohio, having an awesome visit the first weekend in June, instead choosing Purdue alongside Bierman and not the Mountaineers. Elijah Crawford was down between Maryland, or there was it Elijah Crawford? Yeah, choosing between Syracuse, Rutgers, and West Virginia, and didn't pick the Mountaineers. Samari Reed, a 4-star wide receiver that West Virginia hosted on that first weekend in June, choosing Ole Miss. And now just this past Monday, Shianta Stewart, cornerback from Winton Woods High School, the same high school as David Long, fringe 3-star, 4-star cornerback, also choosing Indiana over West Virginia. So this is all to say that I'm very happy with some of the recruits that West Virginia's had. And I'm never gonna fault a kid for wanting to be a Mountaineer if West Virginia extends them an offer. I can fault West Virginia for extending them an offer in the first place and questioning why you did so. And that's what I'm going to do in this video with some of these targets that West Virginia did extend offers to, those players accepted, and I'm asking myself why. Because save for my recent memory of the last few years, there have been few times that West Virginia has pulled an offer that I can remember from a player. I don't think there maybe hasn't. A player that West Virginia extended an offer to, the player committed, and then without checking out unnecessarily another school that West Virginia pulled an offer from. Now, the experts on Rivals or 247 Sports, those guys, they might have those note and their history logs of player that's happened with this staff. But I can say that it's fewer than you can count on one hand. So when I see guys, even like Elgin Sessions, whose offers only really include teams from the Sun Belt and FCS, or Taylor Brown, same difference, and Chris Filippo, who was committed to James Madison, 2-star, Michael Hasty, linebacker, same difference, Evan Powell, defensive lineman, 6'4", 245, 3-star. I'm very, you can have a few of those players, in your recruiting class, and there's, it is an inexact science. Do not get me wrong. This is not, as I've said a number of times and can fully admit, Pat White was a 2-star wide receiver, or fringe 2-star, 3-star wide receiver prospect that Rich Rodriguez promised to come here and play quarterback for me, and he blossomed into the best quarterback in program history, or second best to Major Harris, however you want to skew it. Or Steve Slayton did not receive an offer from Maryland, who he had was fully flat out going to go to. West Virginia gives him the offer. He turns into arguably the best running back in program history. You have these kinds of outliers. I'm just saying, by the aggregate, it seems as if there is kind of a scatter the seeds philosophy with the way that the roster management is going with high school prospects. And if the cream rises to the crop within year, as I've been saying on this program for over, since I've started it, is whoever's going to keep up in their development, and if not, they're going to get recruited over, because West Virginia is taking a Johnny Majors type of 1970s, 80s style of recruiting. Is they're going to cast out a wide net to try and get as many high school players as possible and see how they develop within their first, maybe into their second years. And then, someone's got to replace them. And with the transfer portal these days, sayonara, half your roster is out the door to another program. Or, a third, as Neil Brown is now saying. So a lot of these players out of this high school recruiting class, I'm just looking ahead in rosters for 2025 and beyond. And just like this past fall 24 recruiting class, there are a lot of project players who, again, I'm all for, a project player here and there, but I look at the recruiting of what transitioned and transpired from when West Virginia reached kind of its glory days, if you want to call that, in the mid 2000s under Rich Rodriguez. To Bill Stewart, you can say with what you want about his, coaching decisions with bringing in Jeff Mullen, which I chronicled on my last video about the greatest quarterbacks West Virginia's had, ranking them over the last 20 years. West Virginia was pulling in the ballpark of around 5, definitely 3, but upwards of 5 4-star players during those Bill Stewart years. And then, so West Virginia was right on the precipice of breaking in consistently into the national top 25. I'm going by Rivals. That's the one I usually go for all of my recruiting knowledge for over the years. Then we got into the Dana Holgorsen era, and it seemed like it dropped from around 5 to 4, maybe 3. And we all know how lazy of a recruiter that Dana Holgorsen was. Those first few years still brought in some, good recruits. I think was riding kind of the coattails of the Orange Bowl victory. And then once we got to Will Grier, he pretty much quit recruiting. And now, under Neil Brown, West Virginia is not, and you can look at the history on Rivals from that 2019 class, which he salvaged from Holgorsen, but 2020 to this now into this 2025 class, and West Virginia is not bringing in the quantity of 4-star, and we still haven't had a 5-star player since Noel Devine 17 years ago. So the talent acquisition is just lagging behind. And when I see a school like Purdue pulling in 2 4-star recruits over West Virginia, I'm saying to myself, Purdue is coming off of its worst year in like 20 years. They have a brand new head coach, is greener than Neil Brown. When has Purdue been good in my lifetime, other than like Drew Brees' one year? I've been there, like through Lafayette, West Lafayette, but I've been to Lafayette, Indiana. What does that have, like school? I know academically related, but I mean just the town and the campus and everything that Morgantown doesn't have. So I wonder if this is necessarily, and you can counter that argument. Well, then why did West Virginia win the recruiting battle of, let me get his name real quick, Montaven Quisenberry over Kentucky? If the SEC and the Big Ten are seeing writings on the wall in the next year because of this House case, that they're going to have to now front the bill for essentially the NIL for its football players, not the outside third-party vendors. Are these collectives for these SEC and Big Ten schools this recruiting cycle using more of their budget that they totally expected before the House case going final, and West Virginia's getting beat in NIL? Or is it the same thing with the SEC, Big Ten? They understand the TV dollars that are now going to be coming in from ESPN and Fox starting this year that makes a difference. And they are going to have now more money so that they can provide more to their players for retention and high school recruiting, transfer recruiting. And West Virginia, realizing how much money it has to spend on retention efforts. And I'm sure that this retention effort for this year's team is so much different than the team that just was put on the field 2 years ago. Remember, CEO of Country Roads Trust, Stephen Ford, told the Raspy Voice Kids podcast, I think it was, last summer going into the 2023 football season, that the 2022 roster was $1 million in NIL. How much better is this roster than 2022? So what is the dollar figure that's being commanded by these players? How, in perspective of how much Country Roads Trust has raised, and what WVU is supposed to, moving forward because of the House case, going to have to pay its football players to make up the difference. and how much effort Country Roads Trust has had to put toward its retention efforts. Phenomenal. Mountaineer Nation has done phenomenally, I feel like, in support of Country Roads Trust, especially since Ren Baker has come onto the scene, and the $1 Million May campaigns and the anonymous matches and so on and so forth. But it's unsustainable. And you're reading about this, in articles all across the country, and have been going on for about a year now, about how the donor fatigue and so on and so forth. So when teams like, and I was reading this article a week ago or so, I cannot remember the publication, I'm sorry for this video, that teams like Oregon and Ohio State this year are apparently having in the ballpark of over $15 million or more for its NIL, for its football roster. Just goes to show what West Virginia is going to have to spend to even just be half that. And that all filters downstream to high school recruiting. It truly does. And that's what we've seen now, because, as I said about 6 weeks ago, 75 to 80% or more of this fall 25 recruiting class is done. I mean, when you have 21 commitments, I'm looking at the roster, the anticipated roster for 2025. Yes, I'm that much of a no-life that I track West Virginia's football roster this time of the year, even for 2025. And I'm looking down the roster, and they're already at 87 projected scholarships to be used for next year. So they're already 2 over. So I know, as I said, like Neil Brown will expect come this December, which will be here before you know it, 33% or more of this roster will turn over. And you're just like shaking your head like, how do you keep up with it? It's constant. Roster management and recruiting is 75 to 80% of Division I Power 4, now Power 4 roster. Power 4 football. Just ask James Franklin. You can be around a 70%, you can, whatever his career win percentage at Penn State is, which I think the last time I checked is somewhere around 70%, if you can just out-recruit your competition. And right now, it's a dollars and cents game. And it's sad, and it sucks, because what I fear, and don't take all of what I'm saying in this video as like the sky is falling, is the way things are going is the SEC schools and the Big Ten schools, now with this House case settlement and the money that they've gotten from ESPN and Fox, are going to be able to pay for the best high school talent. And if it's between Maryland and West Virginia, and Maryland can offer a Brody McWhorter, let's say, a $500,000 NIL deal, and West Virginia can offer a $250,000 NIL deal. And in the grand scheme of things, against what Nico Iamaleava, I know I'm butchering that last name, got from Tennessee, or Monte Morris, Raja Bell's son, I think his name's Jaden Bell, 5-star out of this 25 recruiting class, is getting an NIL deal higher than Nico Iamaleava, in the ballpark of $8 to $10 million a year for a 5-star high school quarterback. That's just what it means to show that Country Roads Trust can't just have a $1 million May campaign. It's going to have a $10 million campaign. And like I said, I'll never doubt the ability for Mountaineer fans on anything. But how is that sustainable? And I know we're going to come to a point with this house settlement case. What's going to be eventually figured out is kind of a level playing field on what the schools are going to allocate toward its athletes. That the quarterback at West Virginia versus USC versus Mississippi State versus Purdue are, I feel like, all going to be paid on the same level. Because again, the Title IX component and how that comes into play and how that shakes out. But again, and then whatever schools' collectives want to pay higher to market value, because if you have to pay everybody the same, or how that works. I don't see a way in which it's going to work, in which the payroll for, I don't know, maybe I'm getting too deep into the weeds here like this, but I guess the bigger picture is, when you hear read articles or hear about the Big 12 exploring options for private equity, or WVU Athletics is looking into logos being put on jerseys on Mountaineer Field behind me, Milan Pushkar, I don't know if, because I know he's passed, so if it's just names necessarily in honor of him as a booster, or he has, his money has gone toward naming rights for the stadium. So again, wouldn't surprise me if the money's not necessarily there. It's been Milan Pushkar Stadium for over 20 years now. If it becomes something else with the naming rights attached to it, that sponsorship at WVU Athletics is going to go to an entirely new level, and it's going to have to for all of these Big 12 schools if it wants to keep up in the resources, which is eventually going to turn into NIL dollars for football players predominantly, and dollars, secondarily for men's basketball players, to get high school recruits to come, bringing this all full circle between all of this. So it may give credence to what high school player recruiting director Trey Nair was saying in a podcast this past winter with the In the Gun podcast with Jed Drenning and co. That as to why WVU football doesn't necessarily target some of these guys who are on the top 250 according to Rivals national database list, and they're looking for more of the Owen Schmitz, the unsung heroes that they can find, out of thin air, gems, diamonds in the rough that they can uncover. Get them into the nutrition program, get them into strength and conditioning with Mike Joseph, and by the time they're a 22-year-old player, doesn't matter if you bring in a 5-star 18, 19-year-old, they believe that their fourth year, fifth year senior is going to be better than what you can put onto the field. And that is what we're just ultimately going to have to see as fans. The proof is going to come into the pudding finally this season, and definitely next season, as the transition from Garrett Green over into Nico Marchiol and all the cast of characters that Neil Brown and co. There are no more built-in excuses. There really wasn't last year, but definitely now at this point in time, entering now his 6th season. He's coming up, Neil Brown, with the extension. If he plays out the rest of this extension, will coach longer than Dana Holgerson. Dana Holgerson was 8 seasons in Morgantown and became the 3rd winningest head coach in program history, I think it was. 3rd or 2nd. So the proof is in the pudding now, starting now, because what happens for the fall 25 recruiting class and beyond is what affects, if we're going to give a wash to pretty much 2019 to 2022 on Neil Brown's career coaching record, then that's what he's going to have to be judged from 2023 and beyond. So I'm a little bit skeptical of this fall 25 class. I think there are some studs. I do. I think there are some guys, who can down the road definitely play a role into this, will work their ways into the depth charts sooner rather than later. But then there are a lot of these guys on here that I'm thinking, are just project players, and we'll see how it wears out. And it's just it's very confusing to me. Some of the things that Neil Brown has said over the years. Specifically, I'll point out a case example. It was once Bryce Ford Wheaton, Winston Wright, that whole cast of guys who were brought in, and I think the last of them is Allie Jennings, who's now at Virginia Tech. And it was after I think the 2022 season, he was saying about how, we didn't have necessarily the greatest locker rooms worth of leaders at that point in time. too many mouths to feed at the wide receiver position. So, we're going to be much more conscious about how many numbers that we take. And I'm looking now, looking at next year's, the fall, 25, guys committed now. Once they're a part of the roster next year, you're losing your Justin Robinson pretty much, who will graduate, just a one-year flyer from Mississippi State transfer. Jaden Bray, Preston Fox, Hudson Clement, Jarrell Williams, Rodney Gallagher, Traylon Ray, Torrey Johnson Jr., Dom Collins, Rick Darius Farmer, Brandon Raymond, Keyshawn Robinson, Jaleel Hall, Montaven Quisenberry, Tyshawn Dews, and Tariq Mallory. How many names did I just name there? Are you telling me that's going to be your entire list of wide receivers? Like, they're all going to want the ball. They're not going to want a red shirt. Like, I just don't know what to believe sometimes. Is like, okay, if we're going to have smaller numbers at the wide receiver position for the roster, and you're still going to have, 15? Like, I don't know what to believe. So, hard to manage. Apparently, West Virginia is not out necessarily on Wilnerson Telemake, the guy who who committed to Wisconsin. That might go down to the wire to signing day. But losing out on Bierman, losing out on Galloway, losing out on Reed, Jeffrey Cobb from BlueGoldNews.com, great Twitter follower for high school recruiting and keeping track of these with unofficial visits. Another one who, like, West Virginia, it seemed like, was going to pull a rabbit out of their hat, that I've forgotten, 31 minutes into this video, was from Ironton High School, the same high school as Reed Carrico, who has just transferred over to, and West Virginia spent a lot of time with their coaching staff and their team coming up to West Virginia 7-on-7s. Sean Terry, a wide receiver from Ironton. It was that same time, right around Nico, that Nick Moore picked Tennessee over West Virginia. Terry decommits from Notre Dame. You're thinking he had just been at West Virginia's 7-on-7 camp, in which Ironton won, I think the day before or day after he decommitted, thinking, okay, he's on campus, had an official visit slated, everything signing up. Really good article that I can't necessarily just find the details just now, by Keenan Cummings from Rivals, who he went really in depth about how West Virginia has done well with targets landed who take official visits during Neil Brown's time. And I've said this over the course of the last year, is if West Virginia can get players on campus, check out Morgantown, go to Neil Brown's house and hang out on Cheat Lake, hang around the football facility, practice facility, get their photo shoot, they fall in love with it. Like, West Virginia, prior to, I feel like just now, these last few weeks, had done really, really well with yielding guys who came as on-campus visitors. Now this doesn't look like the case, and I'm scratching my head as to why. Is it because West Virginia overextended too many offers to players who really aren't necessarily high enough caliber, Power 4 level talent, that jumped at the offer of West Virginia as my real Power 4 offer, and I'm going to take it? And then players that were kind of maybe necessarily long shots to land. I'm thinking Galloway. I'm thinking Bierman, maybe in a certain extent. Those guys took away, in a sense, scholarships and a potentially roster spot, at least in the minds of 17, 18-year-old kids. Nobody wants to compete anymore. They want everything given to them. If they can't, already get guaranteed basic playing time, here's where you're going to slot in, here's your development plan as a first-year freshman, then they'll pick somewhere else who's given them that promise. So if they see commitments from other players, they're like, I don't, they already have 4 defensive backs committed. Do I really want to be the 5th? They're going to go somewhere else. And I think that's what happened with Cam Strong. I think that's what happened now with Shianta Stewart. So I hope West Virginia, and I talked about this 6 weeks ago, is choosing quality over quantity because they're now finally in a place, I feel like, with this roster that they're in a spot where they can be a little more selective. So at the wide receiver position, I would have liked them to pass on a Tariq Mallory or Jaleel Hall and get a Samari Reed. I would have liked them to say, I'm sorry, we like you, Taylor Brown. We like you, who's the other? Evan Powell, but we want to get Wilnerson Telemake in here, and allocate the necessary NIL resources to that player instead. I would have held off on just about everybody they got in the defensive backfield for Galloway. At linebacker, that would have been, the writing was on the wall. The opportunities there for the taking for Bierman. To pick West Virginia. Maybe got a little bit skeptical of how soon he would start with Ben Cutter, with Josiah Trotter, with I'm trying to forget, Trey Lathan. I know who's more years ahead, but ahead of him. And the last one I'm trying to think of at the top, or I kind of just lost my train of thought there on whatever player that I was just going to mention next. But you get what I'm saying here, is that West Virginia, the difference is it the NIL component? Is it they wanted to try and get commitments in the bag, in hand already before season ended? Because if the way that this commitments are right now, with West Virginia listed according to Rivals 24th in the country, if they stopped today, this recruiting class wouldn't be top 25. It would fluctuate somewhere within the 40s, 40s to 50s, and that's just kind of the way it's going to be. So, what can West Virginia do over these next several months? I think they got to still hit the recruiting trail hard for some outside linebackers. I think they got definitely one in Ramondo Johnson. And then again, this is dependent upon if West Virginia is truly, and I'm going to talk about this tomorrow on my Big 12 recap video, if West Virginia is truly trying to go to a 3-4 base defense or sticking with the 3-3-5. I've talked about this before. 3 seniors going to be leaving after this season. So, it's Bobina and Wuka and a whole bunch of other unknown, I feel like, at outside linebacker. So Ramondo Johnson, would I like to see Bierman fill in there. A lot of defensive backs already been added to what was already a loaded defensive back class of the fall 24 recruiting class. And then on the defensive line, if there's a way to potentially flip Nick Moore back, getting Amir Leonard John Charles, 4-star defensive lineman, was huge. I always say, any guys who are 300 pounds or more, sign me up. Bring them in. Let's see if we can work them in immediately. Love having this guy. So to have 2, I think, is only going to benefit this defensive line that I feel like once these seniors, Vetti Vesterinen, Sean Martin, and just a 1-year guy in TJ Jackson leave after this season, also Fatorma Molba out of eligibility, West Virginia is going to have to completely reload, I feel like, on the defensive line for next season. So it's a lot of what I feel like is just throwing darts at a wall and seeing what sticks. On the defensive side of the ball, the offensive side of the ball, because there is so much still young talent, I feel like up and coming at wide receiver, on the offensive line, still having Nico Marchiol in the wings at wide receiver. Running back is 4 deep, going ahead and into even next season. If, say, a CJ Donaldson doesn't go pro. The offensive side, I'm not scared right now, especially because you have Brody McWhorter and potentially his cousin Bear 4-star offensive linemen in the wings for the next recruiting class. So, a lot to say here. I know I'm about 40 minutes in. Love to get your thoughts on everything that I've said. I know I've kind of ranted all over the place about what I've had to say with NIL impacting high school recruiting and the players that West Virginia is targeting, perhaps not necessarily the highest caliber of player that West Virginia could potentially pursue, but instead opting for maybe some other guys who you can get the commitment from as a senior, but isn't necessarily the one that, the 4-star or some. You got to fight some of these other schools, namely in the SEC and the Big Ten, to get their commitments from. Who do you like out of this fall 25 class you think could really potentially change my mind, or could surprise some people? Like I said, what I watched of Montaven Quisenberry's highlight tape, I was really, really impressed. I think Terrence Edwards has the physical build. I think he's like I watched his commitment video. I mean, everything that his coaches had to say about him, I'm really excited about him. Love the size of Jean Charles on the defensive line. And then, like I talked about this right before we kicked into the recruiting season, what they were able to do on the offensive line and getting some big bodies. Like, I love that. The Gavin Crawford out of Good Counsel and Aiden Buchanan. And then bringing in DeAndre Desenor was really the cherry on top as your highest rated recruit right now. So what are your thoughts? Where am I right? Where am I potentially wrong? Am I being a little too overcritical? Like, I try to not make too much out of the decisions of 17 to 18-year-old kids and their impact on a college football program that they haven't even joined necessarily yet. But like I said, the lifeblood of college football is recruiting. It is. It only really matters about your ability to out X and O a coach, out coach them per se on the field, comes in, the high, like, conference championship game dependent matchups that are usually nationally ranked. The Bedlam game comes to mind. Ohio State, Michigan always comes to mind. Last year it was Oregon, Washington. And then, of course, in those conference championship games and the college football playoff. If you can get the better Jimmies and Joes, the X's and O's can a lot of times take care of themselves because you just strictly have more talent than the other teams that you're playing. So maybe that changes in the new world of college football between the SEC and Big Ten tearing apart the Pac-12 and the Big 12 with Texas and Oklahoma. So we'll see. As for what I would say in these last few minutes here to try and round this out before 50 minutes, what will I expect tomorrow out of Neil Brown? I would love it if he could throw some jabs back at the media for last season. If you recall, walking into 2023 Big 12 Media Day, West Virginia being picked 14th, last in the Big 12 Conference, really Neil Brown quietly disrespected through silence of barely asking him a question or two to enter the season. Pretty much everybody was thinking if you lose two of your first three games, namely the Pitt game, after losing to Penn State week 1, you'd be canned. We'd be talking about someone different for this upcoming season. Well, Neil Brown should walk in there and spit some flames. I really would love to see that. Here's the tough thing is, like, what does it necessarily matter? You do the talking on the field. So what, whether West Virginia is picked 14th or what they're picked this year in 7th really makes no difference on paper. You play it out on the field, and that's what it means to say. But West Virginia's got to fight back at these media members who continuously, if they're outside the sphere of WVU media, and those local guys that in this conference and nationally just completely, totally forgets about. Totally just, they're a blip on the radar. West Virginia, who? So that's what I mean to say. I would go back at him if I was Neil Brown. And then, I want to hear what he has to say potentially about this defense for this upcoming year. I think we're going to get a lot of questions about Garrett Green and this offense, rightfully so, because that's what always draws the headlines is the quarterbacks and how many points you're going to put up and what you're going to be able to do. And looking at the representation, you got Garrett Green, you got Wyatt Milam, Aubrey Burke, Sean Martin, all got. I think Milam's switching out for Zach Frazier last year, so these guys are pretty well versed at this event, and have talked to media members before, so they know what they're doing, and now have a little bit more after 2023. Some confidence. I would say I would walk into it and talk about. I want to hear how they feel about what they were able to build in 2023 and how this parlays into 2024. What they're excited for, what they're going to bring to the table, and try and compete for a Big 12 championship. And if that is the goal, if that is necessarily the goal for this season, how high have they set it? So that's what I'd ask him. I want to know about this defense. I want to know, how they feel about this offense, of how good it could be in comparison to, say, 2018 when West Virginia was putting up 40 points per game on average. And then thirdly, how high can the ceiling for this team be? Because you can't look back. You can't, and I know that FanDuel and some of the other betting sites out there have only put, I think, the over-under for this season at 6.5 games. So very concerning. Strength of schedule, according to ESPN, to start the season is the highest of any is the most difficult, I would put it that way, of any Big 12 team. I think 39th in the country, hardest schedule, what I read earlier today from ESPN. So it's going to be tough. It's not easy sledding on paper whatsoever, but it's once you slap the chin strap on, it's football at the end of the day. So you can't worry about the other 11 opponents that you're going to play for a season before you worry about playing Penn State August 31st. So I think you're going to get a lot of that. I like how honest Neil Brown was this past year, and I like the edge that he brought. So I hope that's just a continuation of that against this Big 12 media, and, can have some fun with it. So I think that'll be it for today. I'll be back tomorrow to recap Big 12 Media Day, those thoughts from Neil Brown. We'll talk about the roster that was put out in the media guide and some other thoughts from the day. So thanks for tuning in about this recruiting video. Let's go. Hail West Virginia.